This image is maybe a little early for this, and that we're not going to talk really about the founding of a republic based on natural law, or hop in the car with Jefferson, Franklin, and John Dickinson for maybe the beginning of next chapter. But why not? You know, you gotta get your attention here somewhere. Here's a image from back in the day. This is a British cartoon depicting the repeal of the Stamp Act. You'll see Grenville here. This figure is Lord Grenville with the tiny little baby coffin. And it's a baby coffin because the act only lasted about a year, right? It was dead after about a year. All kinds of stuff that we can interpret here, and maybe we'll do some stuff in class interpreting this image. Some small things to point out: the Grenville, the baby coffin. Again, this skull has a 1745. That 45 number is ubiquitous in imagery of the American Revolution, referencing, as I said in the last, or 2 lectures ago now, I suppose, the 45th issue of a publication in which John Wilkes, not John Wilkes Booth, John Wilkes, a British politician, published a kind of scathing takedown of King George. Got in trouble for that. Anyway, that 45 you see, also the Jacobite rebellion in 1745. So that 45 you see a lot everywhere. So maybe we'll do some work on this. There's a lot of stuff in here. Champagne Charlie. Let's talk about Champagne Charlie, Charles Townshend. As I was making this image, I realized that Charles Townshend also kind of looks like Eminem, a young Eminem. This is a pre-work Eminem. But Champagne Charlie. Why is he Champagne Charlie, Charles Townshend? He was infamously taciturn, quiet, but once he returned to Parliament late at night, about 8 o'clock, Parliament's packed, and he gave what was apparently a very funny, rousing, and meandering speech. Talked about the colonies, talked about representation, all kinds of stuff. Told jokes. Well, as you can imagine, the name Champagne Charlie is not for nothing. He was apparently loaded when he gave the speech, and the name stuck. And sticks to this day, obviously. All right, Champagne Charlie, Charles Townshend. The eponymous, is that how you say that word? Acts, the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend. Taxes. The colonies generally, the taxes are on goods going into the colonies, right? So they're not generating taxes from things produced in the colonies, consumed in the colonies. A lot of these taxes are things that are coming in from outside. Again, mercantile logic here. Paper, glass, lead, tea, all kinds of stuff, right? Stuff that colonists use to make stuff, to consume, whatever. It also pays for the salaries of colonial governors, as opposed to them being paid through the kind of colonial purse, which, again, obviously leaves them a little bit more attached to the decision-making processes of the local governments. This way, you figure if England is paying your salary, you're less beholden to the locals. And then continuing on with the admiralty courts, again, that is taking people and not trying them in a local jurisdiction, but trying them elsewhere. Again, as I've made much of, you'll see this as we look at the Bill of Rights, some of the stuff that comes out. Americans, as they do, get together and boycott, and it works. Trade falls by 50%. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty spearhead this. The Sons of Liberty out in public, intimidating and beating people up who aren't in line with the boycott, or tax collectors or inspectors, you name it. Daughters of Liberty doing the Republican motherhood thing, making clothes at home, brewing, coming up with teas that aren't right from India or abroad. And all kinds of other things to help the colonists be more self-sufficient. They drop it, right? So after they start dropping it, as the cartoon shows, about a year, and then eventually it dies by 1770. It doesn't make them any money. It's more trouble than it's worth. They get rid of it. So again, England is backing down, right? The colonists at this point are feeling pretty emboldened, right? That they've stepped up and protest the Stamp Act, and they won. They protested the Townshend Acts, and they won. They're going to keep at it. Okay, so 1774, we kind of turn towards war. You see here, if we go back here, this timeline ends in 1770, and then I jump forward to 1774. The Boston Massacre happens, I think, in 73. That's a big deal, obviously. But for the most part, there's a few years of kind of calm. After the Townshend duties are repealed, yeah, the Boston Massacre happens, and colonists are not happy about that. Obviously, this is a form of kind of, it is sort of police brutality, right? The killing of these protesters. The colonists aren't happy about it, but for the most part, besides that one incident, pretty peaceful. 74, things start to change. This is where they start having tea parties. Really, it's political theater. I'll share a meme that I made in class that gets to this point, maybe the theatrical element of the tea parties. But they get attention. They certainly get the attention of Lord North, who, now that Champagne Charlie is gone, the Lord North is the PM that we're going to be dealing with. Parliament responds with what are known as the coercive or the intolerable acts if you're a colonist. Boston Port Act effectively shuts down the port of Boston until they can pay back the money for all the tea. Administration of Justice Act, this is more with the Admiralty courts. Massachusetts Government Act effectively shuts down the local colonial government in Massachusetts. And then the Second Quartering Act allows British troops, or colonials have to open up their homes to British troops, so not just farms, barracks, and things like that, but their actual homes. Let me have a sip of water here. And then the Quebec Act is not really technically, has nothing to do with the coercive or intolerable acts, but the colonists are starting to get a little bit paranoid here. And this is important. An important part of the revolutionary culture that emerges in this time period. And we'll see it pop up time and again in American history, this kind of paranoid suspicion kind of attitude. And this is something that overtakes the colonists. So they see the Quebec Act, which has nothing to do with these other acts are punitive. There's no doubt about it. They're meant to punish Massachusetts in particular for their role in fomenting all of this revolutionary spirit. Quebec Act has nothing to do with it, but it's seen as having something to do with it. It basically limits the colonists' ability to expropriate or take French land. It protects the 60,000 some French Catholics in Quebec. The colonists, largely Protestant, don't like that. They don't like Catholics anyway. And they say, look, the English government is doing more to protect these French-speaking Catholics than they're doing to protect us, right? This is the attitude of the colonists. They want to steal more land, as the colonists always want to do. They want to take other people's land, and the British government won't let them. They don't like it. So what do? They get together and they have a little meetup. The First Continental Congress. This is the one that doesn't matter as much. This is the kind of meeting before the big meeting. You all are fortunate enough to not be old enough to have to sit through interminable meetings after meetings, or meetings at the end of which they talk about hosting the next meeting. But this is happening in the 18th century too. They have the first meeting, which is the First Continental Congress in 1774. They invite a bunch of people, right? Barbados, Jamaica, Nova Scotia, Florida, come on. A lot of them don't show. It's really only at this point, still no Georgia. Georgia really has royal government, so they're not really getting in line here. 12 out of 13. But remember back, Albany Plan of Union, 7. Stamp Act Congress, 9. Now we're to 12. Georgia will eventually get their act together and show up and state their case, not to like the last minute, but eventually we'll get 13 colonies showing up. But again, this shows you how there's an increasing sense of unity in the colonies on mainland North America, not Nova Scotia, not the northernmost, not Florida, certainly not the Caribbean. That's a whole other thing. But what we now will know as the 13 colonies. We're getting there. Joseph Galloway has a plan to kind of, everyone wins. The colonists get what they want. The British government gets what they want. That doesn't happen. I think it falls short by about 1 vote. What do they adopt? A few things. I'm not sure if these are in your book, actually. Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves are the kind of like what we would call hawkish demand, the warlike, kind of like blustery demand. It is the immediate repeal of the intolerable acts. The Declaration and Resolves is the more dove-like or peacemaking, olive branchy kind of, not olive branch like the food place, but olive branch like the biblical like sign of peace olive branch. The Declaration and Resolves is that a more moderate response. It asks for a proper redress of colonial grievances. And I think that's actually the wording. It's about redress of grievances, which is, again, important. The First Amendment, which, most people, it's so much about the freedom of speech that people actually are so free to like not understand what it means. Right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to petition your government for redress of grievances, Declaration of Resolves. So again, amendments, right? When we look at the Bill of Rights, we see it all throughout. Continental associations, this allows for the organizing of committees of correspondence. If any of you remember back to modern or AP world, the various committees of the French Revolution, these are kind of similar. They are pretty intense. They make sure that everyone is fighting for liberty by policing people's liberties. Again, loyalists get harassed. People breaking boycotts get harassed, intimidated. So, we could have a debate in class about how we feel about this, but that's the way it is, right? Again, this is a kind of lived democracy. It's a very in-your-face thing, and it's a very unified mentality. And if you're outside of that unified, patriotic resolve, right, you're in trouble. And then they say, look, let's get together again in 8 months or something. Again, this is the colonial period. This is the 1770s. It's not like a Zoom meeting. It's not like, they don't have the 405. It takes a long time for someone to get from Philadelphia back to, say, Charleston, South Carolina, and then to caucus with their constituents, with other politicians, local politicians, come up with some ideas, send letters back and forth, and then head back to Philly. So the idea is if the English government doesn't respond appropriately to these various resolves, primarily the Suffolk Resolves and the Declaration of Resolves, then they're going to have to get back together and decide next steps. Right? Again, not revolutionary yet. They are very mindful to profess their loyalty to the king, but they are saying Parliament is the problem. So again, if we go back, is it in this lecture where I talked about the Stamp Act? Yes, here. So Stamp Act. They are. Well, maybe it's not here. Yes. Appeal to King and Parliament. So with the Stamp Act, recall, they are appealing to King and Parliament in 1765. By the time we get to the First Continental Congress here, they are talking about Parliament is the problem, right? Parliament is a problem. King's fine. Parliament's a problem. Eventually, we'll get to, when we get to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, again, as I said, it is the king, the king, the king, the king. And that is the revolutionary moment. Okay. Disparate factions. So as I've mentioned, a revolution doesn't mean everyone wants, yes, they all want the same thing in the sense that they all want more freedom. They all have a beef with Parliament or the king. But if you look at the details of what these different factions want, they're quite different. In New England, you have on the one hand, wealthy merchants who are making, look, they're not doing bad. They're making a lot of money. This is not, we don't need to feel bad for the poor Boston merchants. They are making a lot of money. They want to make more. And they want free trade, which is an emerging idea that pushes back against the mercantile system of trade, right? That doesn't make sense. You know, if I can get a cheaper product from a French colony, why do I have to buy it from the British? So they want that. Local legislatures obviously want to continue on in this tradition of independence, and they want to push it even further, right? They're not saying they want to be totally independent, but they want some degree of autonomy. They want to be treated like equals. They want the British Parliament to understand and respect that the colonial scene is different and that different things should be happening in the colonies as opposed to in London. Those are specific demands, and those two things are not the same, right? So politicians wanting more political freedom is not the same as some Boston merchant wanting like a bigger mansion, right? Not the same thing. Along the western border, you have wealthy speculators and colonial generals. As your book points out, George Washington theoretically should have like 50,000 plus acres of land somewhere, and it could be west of the proclamation line of 1763. That's land he could sell and make a lot of money. Jefferson also, a lot of land that he could sell potentially on the other side of the proclamation line and make a lot of money. So that's a different faction. That's not the same as either of the first two in the North. Just because these southern land speculators want to make money and a Boston merchant wants to make money, those are really different things. One is a kind of like fledgling capitalist ideology. The other one is like a landed aristocracy ideology. And then you got the poor squatters, right? They've stolen land, they're on illegal squats, and they want to keep their illegal squats. That is a very different group than the wealthy speculator. And in the South, lastly, you have wealthy enslavers who are wondering what the English are up to. If they can pass the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties and the Intolerable Acts, what might they be up to beyond that? And for some Southerners, the worry is, as your book says, right, that they are worried about their debt-burdened properties. That's people. Right. So as I mentioned a couple lectures ago, a lot of enslavers use human property, their chattel, as collateral to get loans to invest in more crops or manufacturing or what have you. So they are heavily they're highly leveraged. Right. They've got a lot of debt on hand and not a lot of cash. So they're worried if the British come a-calling, they could take all those enslaved people away and send them, either free them in the most extreme example, or send them to Jamaica or something like that, right? Take them away. So that is a fear of the Southerners. That is different from these other groups as well. And the Southern fear isn't for nothing, right? It's not for nothing. Because in this time period, we have Lord Mansfield pictured here in the background. Your book mentions Mansfield early on in the chapter in a different context, but Mansfield is important to these freedom suits as well. In the 1750s, beginning in the 1750s, enslaved people start suing for their freedom in English courts, and they start winning. There's no place in English common law that says slavery is allowed, right? There's stuff about like, villanage or some kind of medieval thing, but it's not hasn't been practiced in hundreds of years. Indentured servitude is a different thing altogether. So Somerset versus Stuart is one of the first major cases, and it is an enslaved man suing for his freedom, and he wins. Knight versus Wedderburn, also the enslaved person wins. So this is news that would have traveled to the colonies, obviously, Somerset versus Stuart being pre-revolution, but this would really scare an enslaver in the South that, well, wait a minute, are the winds of change blowing in a different direction, and what should we do in response to that? This is another very interesting thing. So anyway, Mansfield in the background, he's the one that rules on the Somerset case. It says there's no place in English common law that says slavery is legal. It was a very narrow ruling, didn't apply to the 13 colonies that had a whole other legal slavery thing going on. But the way that the law often works is things progress from there. William Wilberforce, who someone will learn about later, probably famous white English abolitionist, was very influenced by a lot of folks who wanted to abolish the transatlantic slave trade beginning in the late 18th century because they saw it as a way to undermine the French power. English colonies, this includes, say, South Carolina or Virginia, but also Barbados, Jamaica. They have, by the 1760s, they have a fairly self-sustaining slave population. Where a country like Haiti, or I guess that's anachronistic, I should call it, so I should say Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue before the Haitian Revolution. Saint-Domingue does not. Saint-Domingue has 2/3 of the enslaved laborers are not born in Saint-Domingue. They're born in either Haiti they're born in Africa or in other colonies, and they get to Haiti through a black market trade with English colonies. So early British abolitionism is not about saving enslaved people. It's seen as a way to undermine the French, because if the English, especially if they can get to the Dutch to sign on, which the Dutch don't, but if they got the Dutch to sign on and they could tighten up the supply of enslaved laborers from Africa, it would really hurt Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, which is the most profitable colony in the world at this point, right? It is the most profitable colony, and they are very obviously, they want to get back at France in any way they can, and this is one way potentially to get at France. Southern enslavers see all of this. Southern enslavers want to also maintain slavery. So when we look back at this slide here, some revolutionaries are in it for the money. Some revolutionaries are in it for political autonomy. Some revolutionaries are in it for land. Some are in it for illegal land. Others are in it to maintain a system of slavery. Those are all really disparate wants, but they have the one thing in common is they are increasingly unhappy with Parliament and then ultimately the king. These various factions will cause tension, I guess I said, after the revolution. But in part 3 of this lecture, we will get into the actual war and talk about just the highlights. And then I will move through and move forward into the Second Constitutional Convention and the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, and then the drafting of the Articles of Confederation, which is the OG Constitution. So that will be next time.